Support for this podcast comes from listeners like you. This is an ad-free show and donations are greatly appreciated. To learn more and make a contribution, go to authenticparenting.com/support. Thank you for your generous and kind support. It means the world to me. I am Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. And on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the generational cycle of trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, how to motivate an unmotivated and lazy kid. The first thing I want to say is the choice of this title. I selected it solely for the purposes of search engine optimization. Please do not judge me. I am joined by two wonderful listeners, Imi and Jen. They both showed up to my support call, which I hold bi-monthly, and they are free. And Imi had a question, which I thought was worthy of exploring on the show. It's a question that I receive quite a bit, especially recently. So I asked the ladies for their consent to record. It's a great conversation, but please keep in mind that we did not plan or prepare for it. It's a really real, organic conversation between three moms. And that's the exact reason that I loved it so much. In it, we talked about why your kid might be unmotivated. Is there such a thing as a lazy kid? Is the lack of challenge in our children's life a problem? How to teach your children what's important to you. We talked about the impact of technology on our kids and their motivation, the role of role models and stories for teaching values, as well as examining our own fears and seeing them as signals for what we care. And so much more. I really love this conversation. I hope you will enjoy it too and find it helpful. And if you want to learn more about our free support calls for parents that take place twice a month, please consider joining the Authentic Parenting Facebook group. I post announcements about the upcoming calls, or join my mailing list, or just simply get in touch. The calls are informal, no registration necessary, and you don't need to stay during the entire call, which sometimes can last 2+ hours. You can keep your video on or off. It's optional. We want you to feel comfortable. So if you need support with parenting, if you're dealing with some challenges right now, or if you just need community, please join one of our support calls. We start our calls by doing a gratitude practice, then we share updates since many of the members know one another. I've been doing the calls since March 2020 when the pandemic started, and we're still going strong. After we exchange some updates, we discuss a topic, answer someone's question, or just support one another. It's a positive, supportive space for speaking, sharing, listening, asking for advice, giving advice. I can't say enough good things about the calls. Hope to see you on one of our upcoming calls. And now, please enjoy, and thank you for listening. Imi, why don't you phrase your question or your comment again, since we are recording, and then we'll get to speaking about it. I have some ideas. Jen, I'm sure, has ideas, and I want to hear your ideas too.
So my question is, a kid who are kind, good, happy, but they're I don't know if this is the right word, but lazy. They're not too motivated to get a good grade or to exceed in something. And how to, as a parent, how to help these kind of kids to, and a lot of time maybe to find themselves or find their purpose. My thinking is, I guess, in this culture, they are satisfied. They have food. In our case, they have a good parents. Their life is not that difficult, but they're naturally very easygoing, laid back kid. But how to help these kind of kids? Because sometimes, they choose an easier choice. It's easier to not go to college. All the work to put in to apply to college, just let's go to junior college, which that's good too. And there's a lot of ways, but how to help. And I see a lot of kids like this. And so they don't have problem like, screaming or tantrum, or they don't do bad in school. In general, they are happy and they cooperate. They can follow teachers, but they don't have this, drive to do well. And as a parent, I guess part of it might be fear, which I know that shouldn't be the drive, but the fear of how do these kind of kids do in the society. Because certain amount you need to be proactive. So part of it might be fear, and part of it is how to really understand these kids and how to help.
Yeah, I think you're speaking about the big issue here. I definitely notice what you're talking about in the culture, in the kids that I interact with. Parents definitely bring up this topic a lot, this lack of motivation, drive. I often talk about this topic with my friend Irene, and I have several thoughts, and I want to hear what you have to say. And Jen, I don't think there is one cause for this, right? But you mentioned a few things I think are the larger things are important to keep in mind. Our kids have a nice life. They have a lot of good things. They're, minus the pandemic, kids had a decent life, no hardship, no survival. They had to do, I don't know, unless you are growing up on a farm, they don't have much responsibility these days. We do everything for our kids. What is required of them? Not that much. They play sports, they do arts. It's by their choice if they do those activities. They go to school. So what you're talking about is this, they're not striving. The drive is low and they're happy. Like you said, they're good, they're kind, they're happy, and they're satisfied. So I often think about what's underneath our striving. What makes us go far and reach for goals and accomplish things and do things. And I often think about that it comes from a lack and deprivation oftentimes. And because our kids' life doesn't have that deprivation, they're very comfortable with mediocrity, with okayness. Things are the way they are. What's there to strive for? I feel like when we were growing up, I can speak for myself, because of the deprivation, because of the hard conditions, you do have that inner motivation to create a better life, to work harder, to get to something. I see part of this comes from that adversity, from challenge, from lack, from deprivation. And I'm very curious to see this current generation of the American kids, at least. I don't know how it's in the other parts of the world, right? So we can talk about only what we see. I'm very curious. Kids who have a good life, everything, they don't need to work hard, to get things. They don't have to even wait for anything. Things happen. I've shared on the podcast how I didn't have shoes. I didn't have food. That's severe deprivation, severe lack. But in the case where you have everything, what do you work for? That motivation is dampened already. And also social media plays a role, right? It sort of creates that it's so easy to consume. It's short, bite-sized pieces. It's content. You don't have to do much to be entertained, to be educated. You're learning things. It seems like you are learning things. You press a button and you have a lot of information. Maybe you have a lot of tip in your head. And also the parenting plays a role, right? Like we came from a different kind of, we were parented differently, and we sort of loosened the reins, and we gave choice to our kids. We did everything for our kids. And now we're like, they're not motivated. I mean, I think this is a multifactorial problem that you are bringing up. It's an interesting one. I really want to think about this. And I'm really curious to follow the kids that I know who are currently 3 years old, 5-year-old in my community, in my neighborhood, my friends' children. What are they going to achieve? Are they going to become doctors, or do they want to create big things? Because their life is so comfortable and everything is just so given and done for them. Is there natural drive in humans to conquer, to achieve, to create? Or does that come from a lack, deprivation, poor parenting, trauma? I don't know. I really think about this a lot. So what do you have to say? Or Jen, what are your thoughts?
I have been enjoying listening to what you had to say. And I think that we can't know what kind of person we would be without our background. Who's to say you wouldn't have this podcast anyway, even if the things that happened to you didn't happen to you? Who's to say I wouldn't have the interests that I have now if my background wasn't as hard as it was? So first of all, we can't attribute our kids' comfortable lives to their lack of motivation any more than we can contribute our comfortable lives to our struggle and suffering. Those things are so complex that even AI can't figure them out. But I think one factor that I would add to your list is about our expectations. What are we expecting our kids to contribute? Are we expecting them to, on their own, independently, without help, identify something that matters to them and stand up for it and make sacrifices for it? You didn't do that without help. You did that with a lot of external pressures that forced you to do it. But without those external pressures, that has to come from somewhere else, that help that we would offer them. And that might mean that we help them learn to set goals in things that we can tell that they care about. We might ask what kinds of pressures they're facing that we don't see. You mentioned social media, but social lives, even without social media, are pressure filled for kids. So what pressures are they facing there, and how much are they struggling and suffering to overcome those pressures? We might find some drive in them there to be a certain kind of person or not be a certain kind of person. And then knowing what they value, what they care about, we can help them to identify goals that they really would be interested in making some sacrifices to achieve. And what role models do they have? In our worlds that get more and more isolated, we were talking about isolation before we started recording. And these communities that aren't as connected as they used to be, they get exposed to us, their schools, people who look like them and live nearby, and the people they see on social media. And is that enough for them to find an inspiring role model that would motivate that spark inside? You asked a good question. You asked, do humans have these innate desires? I believe that we do. We have these innate desires. And I think that they are fragile sometimes with the pressures that it takes just to make ends meet, just to make it from morning to night sometimes. As things get harder, change faster than they've ever changed before, maybe that is what they're achieving right now. Is not crumbling. And we can give them credit for that too, and let them know that we approve, right? Our support means the world, and we don't know what they'll become, but we can make sure that they know that we'll support whatever it is.
Yeah. Expectations, role models. If we don't push them, if we don't place expectations on them, I always think about this idea that children are like flowers, or, they grow and they blossom eventually, according to their own timetable. And all we can do is support and watch them grow and nurture them. When you set that expectations, that's what I started thinking about, You don't pressure the flower to bloom, right? They just bloom and they just bring their beauty into the world. But from the other hand, I'm also thinking, I wouldn't use the word lazy, but I completely understand what Imi means. Lack of motivation could also mean depression, right? This being disconnected from the real world, from social interactions and being in, the pandemic did a big number too. There's a loneliness epidemic, in our country. We know that. And the younger people are the loneliest generation, not the senior citizens anymore. So does that play a role? Are they more, sort of depressed, disconnected and lonely, but sort of connected, through social media and through other ways? They're playing games online and things like that. And is it maybe a good thing that we're not pressuring them to do things for us? They're just left on their own to figure out what is it that they desire? What is it that they want to do, contribute to the world, whether they want to contribute big things to the world or not. And who is there to say that everybody has to figure out their purpose and serve a purpose, find a contribution, right? These are really big questions to think about. Like, what's our role? Do we need to push our kids outside of their comfort zone? I think we do as conscientious parents. You don't want to limit your child and sort of contain and, create this bubble so that they can stay small. You don't want to push them too much externally so that it comes from your own fears, from your own anxieties, from your own unlived dreams and blah, blah, blah. But how much to push? Because if you don't push, will they one day say, how come you didn't show interest? How come you were, lazy as a parent, for lack of a better word? You didn't push me enough. You didn't show me opportunities. You didn't open doors because I was just a kid. I didn't know that things existed. I think as parents, we do have a role to at least open doors for curiosity, expose them to things, ideas, concepts, and sports and arts and things, not in a pushy way, right? Which could be hard because we were pushed as a generation. And now we're trying to do the opposite. And we're sort of like, we don't know what to do. So I just threw some other ideas out there. Imi, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, listening to Jen, an idea that came up to me was, and you said push. I think giving them opportunity to grow, to fail. And I think you might had a couple podcasts about talking about failing, but we do learn when we fail. We learn about ourselves, what we want. And maybe offering them a lot of experiences that they can find who they are and what they want. But what kind of experience gives that kind of grow? I'm not sure. Like my kids we have done everything among all the three kids, sports and like even with sports. So through the game, they fail, or when they get older, they can tell they're not as good as one of than maybe the other kids. But it seems to I think maybe going deeper in one activity or one thing than doing a lot of different things. The failure doesn't mean that much sometimes for them, or they don't have time to really think through. So that was one thought I had. But I think failure sometimes teach them what they want. In order to know what they want, I guess they have to, and who they are, to find out who they are. I think they do. We need to, as parents, we can offer experiences. And I think a lot of times those kind of experiences can be something we can do at home. I can't come up exactly, but, give them little tasks. And it's a lot in succeeding in a lot of little tasks, give them confidence. And that confidence give them to say, okay, I'm a person who wants to do well in school. Because, they have a certain amount of self-value. So not necessarily, like I do have a kid, they value themselves and they're confident in certain area. I guess they don't want to put the effort in certain area, but maybe that is valid.
Isn't that a wise thing to know where to put your effort? I think that's a really good thing. If they know deep in their heart that this is not worth putting effort into, I think that's a good thing. Unlike our generation, at least the way I grew up, they didn't let us have that choice, that autonomy. We didn't even think twice. I don't want to put my effort into this. You just followed and put your effort, whether you liked it or not, whether you want it or not. I think that's a good thing. But what you're saying is important about the failure. But again, yes, of course, it's important for people to make mistakes and fail and to learn and grow. But what is our attitude about failure as parents? How do we look at failure? What do our children hear us say about mistakes and failures? How do we model or talk about our own failures? That's big part of it too. It's, of course we can say, oh, I want my child to learn, fail and learn and all that. But when they fail, how do we react to that? Is it coming from that nice perspective that we have, like a nice sentiment? Or is it judgmental? Is it, how dare you failed? Or, does our old programming still, drive the bus? I think that plays a huge role. And when they fail, do we support them through that to make sense of their own experience, to draw conclusions about themselves? I think that's important too.
I hear us talking a lot about different values. And I think that's where the fear comes as a parent, is we start to see our children as they get older, especially teenagers that are more aware of the world. They are starting to show that their values are different from ours. We value making a contribution to the world and having this work ethic and whatever, right? Whatever our values are, which there's entire workshops for adults on identifying what our values are. So it's no surprise that our teenagers might struggle with being able to articulate their values and how they're going to live up to them. But a teenager might be demonstrating the value of rest, the value of their relationships to them, the value that doesn't make us very comfortable because it's different from ours. And we really thought that they were going to value the same things we did, the same things we still do. And here you are running your life in a way that doesn't support my values. So I think understanding our own selves, our own values, that's what we mean when we say, what are we afraid of? So what? They're not motivated to do the things we want them to do. What are we afraid of? Well, at the root, we're afraid that they aren't living our values. And honestly, that's not the flower that we want in the end. We want the flower that blooms in its own way, that is expressing its own values. So of all the things we could do, I'm not sure how actionable this is, but helping our teenagers to identify and then express their own values after we've done that for ourselves. Values are where the motivation comes from to do anything. What is it that we value? And what sacrifices would we make to live those and to make sure that that value is part of my daily life, my annual life, the reflection I do at the start of every year? Those are the things that cause us to ask big questions and do big things. So same for them.
That's an important aspect. But how do we do that with our kids on a practical level? What do you think? I mean, how many of us are digging into values with our kids? It's just like we're just blindly parenting here, like figuring stuff out most of the time.
What I know from parenting research is that we convey values through the stories we tell. That's how we connect our ancient values to our kids' lives as they carry on those values going forward. That's the method we use to try and instill the importance of these values into them. So I reflect often on what stories am I telling my kids? What stories are they hearing about my childhood, about the stories and myths that shaped the choices I made? How much are they hearing? That is a question I try to ask myself at least every week. What stories are they hearing? So in parallel to that, then perhaps we ask them for their stories. I see that you're the kind of person that appreciates beauty in gardens, for example. Can you tell me about a time when you really felt accomplished in finding something amazing or helping someone grow something? Or I don't know, what stories do you have around the beauty that you found in gardens? And ask them to tell their stories. And that's how we can take a guess at what their values are and see what stories come out. And it shows that interest. You were talking, Anna, about that fear of What if my kids someday think that I didn't push them enough? Well, we could never be accused of not being interested if we're begging them to tell us stories about things that we can tell are important to them.
And I guess we need patience too. And this, because we won't see the result. The kids will start to show who they are and what their value is. And we see that when they get older, like maybe in their 20s or 30s. So we kind of have to trust in the process, like you're saying, showing our stories and our value and allowing them to their autonomy, but trust in the process. I guess we don't get the result. So the point when they are in teenager, middle school, high school, I might see them as lazy, but actually there are things are happening. And I think I won't get the result till they get a little bit older. So I realized, I guess I need patience. And in order to have patience, I guess I have to trust in the process of what I'm doing is I still have to grow, but at the same time, I'm constantly learning, trying to do the best and trust the process.
Patience is difficult because it's not idle either. Patience is not an idle thing. It's the growth that you do in your own self to not be reactive, to not be afraid while you're waiting to see what those results are, and while you're still working to shape what those results are and to peek into what they might become. Patience is not easy, but I agree, it's definitely a key element.
I think what I'm hearing is coming to me is if we could live our best life that is rooted in meaning and purpose and values for us, that's the best way of showing our kids how to live a meaningful life, number one. For that, we have to do our own inner work and deal with our own traumas and things like that to figure out who we are and live our, authentic self from our authentic self so that they can see, what's possible, what this life is all about. And number two, if we can nurture without any attachment, expectation or outcome or anything, and without fear, which is an impossible task, our children for who they are. If our task of parenting could be just to raise our children and support them in becoming their true authentic self, I think that's it. We don't have to do any more. Because if we honor them and see them and hear them and value them, give them the autonomy to discover who they are, and each flower blossoms through different times. They have their own timetable. Doesn't mean like at the age of after you graduate high school, you know who you are, what you want to do. Not every kid is going to be up to speed. Everybody is different. And I think a lot of cultural programming plays a role, but I also recognize that there is a lot of fear in all of us just to nurture our children for who they are. If somebody, was raised like that, knowing who you are, what you stand for, you were valued and loved just because of who you were as a person, then you would know your value. Then you can live your values and contribute to the world in meaningful ways, in ways that is true to you. It doesn't mean you have to become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or something. Maybe your true value is just to, we don't have to achieve necessarily. That achievement-based mentality comes from this other type of conventional parenting that we're so ingrained in, and it's so hard to let that go. Because I was in an Uber and a driver asks to my daughter, so what do you want to be when you grow up? Like that's the first question people ask you when your kids are teenagers. But that shouldn't be our focus, right? It's not through achieving that we become ourselves. And when you are who you are and you truly know and believe in that, when your parents when they supported you, let's say, in your authentic growth, then there's nothing to worry about. Each of us will contribute to the world in our own unique way. But I think there's so much fear. And who says that college is an ultimate goal? Who says school is a thing we all have to do? Like, let's question everything. I think there's a trend in our culture, right? We have so many homeschooling moms in our community and all of that. But this is so ingrained in us, even us who are parenting differently. I'm putting myself in this bucket. We're parenting differently, but I recognize the limitations and the fears that are still there. That what is my child going to do? How are they going to live? And maybe this is just a very natural fear for a parent to have for their offspring, because knowing that we're going to die one day, we want our offspring to live and survive and flourish. Maybe this is something we can never get rid of. And why should we get rid of that fear? I don't know. What do you think? I'm just saying some random thoughts that come to my mind.
I hear the connection again between fear and values. We're only afraid of things that threaten things that we truly value, our lives being the most fundamental one. But if we're afraid of losing a relationship, that's because we value that relationship. If we're afraid of not achieving things, it's because we value achievement. So looking at what we're afraid of is a very important clue as to what we value. And I agree then that we probably don't ever want to let go. We wouldn't ever want to eliminate that fear, because it's that signal that we value things in the same way that our emotions are signals that we have unmet needs. Our fears are signals that we have values that may be known or unknown to us.
Well, that's such an important point, Jen. And I want to direct that question to Imi, since she's the one who raised this larger question. So, Imi, what are your fears then? When you say that your child is not motivated, and all of that, like, what is your fear? If you can go underneath, like dig deeper, like 5 layers down. What is your first original fear? Let's start with that.
For my kid to be able to support himself, and is a boy, and well, I guess it doesn't matter, boy or girl, but support himself and support a family.
So that's your starting fear. And why is that important to you?
Because I think that makes him happy, or that makes me happy. So to be able to support, to be independent, and even independent enough to have a family.
So it's you want a family for your son, right? You want him to have a family. You want to be happy if he has a family and he's making good money and supporting his family. That makes you happy. As a mom, you're like, I did my job, right? But do you see that's that conventional, traditional programming that we all have, right? What if he chooses not to have a family? What if he chooses to have a job that doesn't pay much, or chooses not to have a job? But he knows what he stands for. He is advocating for something, or he's fighting for a cause, or maybe he's just creating art and not making money. What if he's happy because he's his authentic self, and his authentic self is not that achieving self. He's happy with a simple lifestyle. He has a little garden. He has a small circle of friends. Maybe he's a loner. Like, why are you still worried about that?
Yes, I think, like earlier we said, I think that is a process for me to accept, like if he has a different value from me, or what he wants to be is, if it's completely different from what I want him to be. So I think that is a process for me.
And I think the questions, those what if questions, are not aimed at trying to convince you to let go of that value. It's something you value. That is the truth about you. That is your authentic self. And it's a point for exploration to get to a spot where you need a lot of groundwork to ask this question. But the question could be, hey, kiddo, independence is something that I really value. Here are some stories to show you where I come from there, right? Here's places I've seen that independence wasn't in people's lives and how it worked out for them. And here's where independence was in their lives and how it worked out for them. Here's my stories related to independence. This is something that I really value. I don't know if you value it the same as I do. I'm curious if you do. What are some stories you have around this value of independence? Because people who are dependent are these kinds of people. Do you think that that's true? And right, those conversations about what kind of person is independent, what kind of person doesn't live an independent life, and what does that say about them? And are you this kind or that kind or something in between? Or is independence not even part of your story? Maybe for you, it really makes no difference at all. And the things that matter to you are completely different. My values, for example, I've articulated recently have to do with love and peace. And independence is not something that I personally value. So I can't identify with your fears. I have different ones, very different fears and different realities. And that's okay. The stories I tell my kids and the fears I have for them are all very, very different. But those could be incredibly fascinating, especially with a maturing kid who isn't there yet. And we can give them that perspective that we have. What a gift that we have to give them in our perspective, to say, someday you'll be able to articulate your values through stories the way I've been doing with you. You're not there yet. You haven't lived decades of life like I have. And even more decades, the generations before us, centuries before us, where these values came from. You are part of a long line, right? That's how we instill values, is you're going to carry this on for us or not. You're going to be your own self. And that's also fine. But that's a really cool conversation. That's the best part about teenagers, is the cool conversations that they can engage in that younger kids can't.
True. Yeah. And before we recorded, we were talking about Imi. You said that, you grew up in Japan. We were speaking about cultures and all of that. Jen, you are so right. Not having grandparents, extended family. Like, I grew up hearing my grandmother's stories. I still to this day remember so many stories from her childhood, from her life, neighbors' lives, fables, parables, different stories. It was a big part of growing up. And I did internalize those lessons and values through stories. No one ever sat down and said, let me teach you, kid, the lesson of being responsible or the value of being such and such. It wasn't explicit. It was through how they lived their life and did tell their stories. But we don't have that. We don't have grandparents. We don't have extended family. That storytelling traditions are not being passed down. And for an overwhelmed, busy parent like ourselves, it is very hard to create stories, tell stories. And even if we do, that's still limited. That doesn't, it doesn't come from that same tapestry as like my grandma. Or, you know what I mean? There's something still missing. I'm not saying let's not do that. We still do need to tell stories. But stories are sort of, for me at least, I associate the elders tell the stories, we listen, we grow up. There's something missing in our culture. We don't have that. And so the story is missing too. And sort of there is this artificial environment. Whereas when you were describing growing up in Japan or how I grew up, things were so natural and normal. I grew up seeing my grandmother cook and clean and do certain tasks, and I was just part of it. I learned so many things through just being there. No one taught me explicitly that this is how you do this. Pickle vegetables or preserve fruits and vegetables or do certain things or how live a life. I think in this individualized culture in the United States, we're lacking that. And what you're describing, that larger thing, there's a lot of lack I see. I can see that in my family too. There was something else I was going to ask, but it just flew. It might come back to me. So yeah, I had a question actually. Well, let's think about ourselves. When we feel unmotivated, what is something that helps us to get motivated? Like we always think that as parents, why is it our responsibility to motivate our kids, right? Why do we see what they're doing as unmotivated, right? Maybe they are motivated in some other ways that we're not recognizing, right? And let's turn the lens on ourselves. When was the last time you felt unmotivated in something? And how did you generate that motivation? Did it come from outside? Who pushed you? How did you rely on some kind of resource to gain that motivation? Let's think about this question. I'm asking both of you, and I'm thinking for myself too.
I can tell you about last night. I was unmotivated to go to the worship services we do weekly in the evenings on a weekday. And what I did was lower my standards and said, we will go on Zoom. We will not change our clothes. We will sit in the living room. And it's not what I would want to do for these important services every single week. But for the moment in the season we're in, it was what I could do. So I lowered my standards, and it made it so that I was motivated to do this thing that's important to me, right? Aligns with my values and shows me living them, but in a way that was accessible to the level of resources that I had available to me. It's not always my solution is to lower my standards, but that's what worked for me last night.
Like Jen said, making the task small and easy, to do a little things I can do and then see what happens. That's one thing. Though, like with children with the piano practice, they start like 5 minutes. But my problem will be, yes, how to motivate myself and then how to be consistent. That's my bigger challenge, to continue to be consistent every day. For myself, definitely, and to also to encourage the kids to be consistent. That is difficult. One thought I had is, it's not that I do. I think it does help to be clear in my mind why I'm doing this, and having my value clear or my goals clear. That will probably help. And with the children too, maybe communicating why we are doing this, and having that everybody in a same page might help. Working with the kids, with the students, which I have not taken time to do that with my children, but just came up to my mind, how to motivate myself. And trying to give a little success, like to have the feeling of success. So I guess smaller. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, so I know I'm going to say two things. So I'm going to give two examples. There are things that I naturally want to do, love doing. No one needs to motivate me. I can do them without anything. So let's say playing the piano, learning a new, I play by ear. When I love some piece of music, I sit down and I can spend literally hours practicing so that I can play that song well. It just gives me enormous joy. I'm in charge. I'm in flow. I'm in control. It comes from within. The rewards are there. The confidence grows. The mastery grows. That's just wonderful. But I also know that I want to work out. I want to do strength training at least a few times a week. And I hate doing that. What I learned is this mantra that I say to myself: mood follows movement. So if I can just get started, I don't have to be in a mood to do it, because if I wait for that motivation to kick in, it will never kick in. I know I do not enjoy going to the gym or working out, but I know if I just push myself, the mood will come after I start doing the movement. So that's a mantra I say to myself. And I also know one thing. Again, it comes down to knowing yourself and your values. I don't like exercising on my own. I'm a very relational person. If I can exercise with a friend or with a trainer, I'm in. You call me, I'm out, I'm exercising. So that knowing that about myself, that's a factor that can increase my motivation. Calling a friend saying, hey, can we exercise? Or I work out with a trainer. Because on my own, I simply cannot do it. Again, knowing your limitations, knowing your values, what you can do, what you cannot do, and what type of a person are you? Some people are more, I'm a relational person. Let's just put it that way. I know that anything I want to do, it is through doing with people together that gives me the most satisfaction and the most motivation. And knowing these kinds of things about our children maybe can help us in helping them. Like I know my daughter is also a relational person. Significantly, she's like me. So if, let's say, she's struggling with something, instead of pushing her to do this on her own, maybe a coach, a tutor can help, right? Having that relational aspect is important. I think we talked about a lot of good things. In conclusion, so do you still have that lingering question, or how do you want to ask that question, Imi? Like you came, you asked this question, we generated this whole conversation. We opened a lot of doors that we didn't go into. I hear underlying themes that are connecting this conversation. And when I listen to this podcast, it will be a lot clearer in my mind. But based on what we discussed, how do you think about your question now?
I also feel like I want to go back and listen to this again. There were a couple things that I heard that it really make me think, and I feel like I got some answer. One, I guess it's more about me than my son. He is projecting. And Yuri, I guess I have to be curious. I really never clearly think about my values. Well, I guess there are, but even making it clear, writing it down and looking into in my fear. And one great thing I thought, I never saw fear in a positive way, but I like that the fear shows my value. So I really going to ponder on that and figure out what my value is. And so I feel a lot better, more lighthearted about the laziness. And also maybe trusting beliefs, because he's second year in college. Both my husband and I, we did our best, and we believe we did we thought it was the best, and share our story as much as we could. And I think I also have to trust on the process. We'll take a little bit more, maybe another 10 years or so to see. But meanwhile, I need to inward and learn about myself a little bit more too.
Oh, thank you so much. Wonderful things. Jen, what are your thoughts at the end of our conversation?
I always like ending with to-dos and action items because that's the project manager in me. And this isn't a very satisfying conversation to end with actions and to-do items, but I do think it's very different from a question, Imi, that you might have come in with. My kid is not motivated to do their chores or to do their homework or to do the things I need to help care for the other children in the house, or right. Those very practical things have very practical actions. And when it's a more philosophical concern, it's going to have philosophical answers. So that's where I can be satisfied with our conversation and know that we touched on things that are different factors to think about in settling that in our own hearts and minds, and why it's different for each of us, and why it doesn't have clear actions and to-dos at the very end, because it's different for everyone, coming from different needs, different values, different kids, different families, different everything.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And welcome to Authentic Parenting, where everything is philosophical and you are left to figure out the concrete steps for yourself, people. Because if it was that easy, and concrete steps is wonderful. We all crave that, but it also somehow implies that we have control. We can figure everything out, Again, it sort of reinforces that false notion of control that it's in our sphere of control. But I really love Imi's takeaways, and I am going to listen to this. And there were some practical things. Discovering your values is huge. Investigating your fears every step of the way, every time you have a fear, is huge. Reframing your fear that it's a signal for your values, I think that's invaluable, I learned a lot, and I really appreciate this stimulating conversation with the two of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.